Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I am super excited to welcome back Molly Suber Thorpe. How are you, Molly?
I'm doing really well. Thank you, Tom. I'm so happy to be here. I love doing these events.
Well, we love having you, and this should be a really, really special session. Not only are you showing off your brand new pack, which I was just complimenting you on before we went live, it is truly fantastic, but we're going to be getting into some monograms today, I believe.
Yes, we're going to be combining two different kinds of lettering, flourished calligraphy with like really bold, ornate drop cap letter, and yeah, just having a lot of fun exploring my new brushes and all of that.
Amazing. Well, I always love learning from you. I feel like you are even though I think you're younger than me, but despite that, you're kind of the teacher I wish I had at school. I wish I had a teacher like you at school. I would have just picked up so much more, because you are such a fantastic person at just kind of holding people's hands and going through and making it seem achievable. So without further ado, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so as Tom mentioned, the brushes that I'm using today are going to be from my newest brush pack. And I'm going to now share my screen. It takes just a second here. So today we are making this mixed media monogram, and if you've followed my sessions before, I love working with square canvases just because I think it makes for art that you can quickly share on social media, and it's just a nice ratio that I enjoy. So I have here a 6x6 inch canvas at 300 DPI, if you want to follow along with that exactly. I'm going to just start by changing my background color to something more like an off-white, just because that's a bit easier on my eyes. And I think sometimes I've found now in recordings, it makes it a little bit better for contrast too. So I have this slightly off-white color here. What I first am going to do is draw myself a little grid, because the first of the two letters that I'm going to do is the drop cap type letter. It's not the flourished calligraphy one, that comes second. So we're doing the drop cap letter first. So what I'll do is I'll come down to the letter guides brush set that's in my new pack, and I'm selecting this square grid. I don't want slant lines. I don't care about that yet. We'll use those later. And I'm just going to brush over my screen to get, oops, I'm going to enlarge that slightly, just to get a nice little, almost like graph paper design here. Zoom out. All right. You don't even have to cover your whole screen, because we're just using this to create one letter in the middle. So you could just make like a big splotch of grid in the middle. And now I'll just reduce the opacity, so it's a grid in the background for me. All right, new layer. Here's where we're going to start our sketching. So I'm coming over to my pencils set, and I'm going to select I called it Molly's favorite letter sketching pencil, because that is truly what it is. This is a very pressure sensitive pencil that really allows me to write thin lines if I'm writing gently, and then thicker, heavier lines, just like many real art pencils. So I find that helpful for sketching all different types of lettering. So that's what I'm using right now. And I'm going to start with the letter M. And in order to do that, I'm going to just show you one technique that I like to do when I'm sketching out big drop cap letters that are going to be fancy and ornate. So the technique that I like to use is not to actually draw the ornate aspects first. I actually draw really geometric letters to start with. We're making an M today. I make really geometric letters to start with, and then I go back and I adjust those sharp corners and straight lines to be more ornate. I just have found that that's, for me, a nice way to create a letter that has the right proportions and is ornate in the end. So here's my M. I'm just going to center it a little bit better on the page. I made the width of the left side, about 2 squares wide, and the width of the right side, 3 squares wide. And the reason for that is because when you do draw an M, if you think about where your upstrokes and downstrokes are when you draw an M, that first left side stroke is an upstroke, which is traditionally thinner in a lot of lettering. And this stroke and this stroke are your downstrokes, which are traditionally thicker. So I've just very tentatively sort of used that concept in my sketch here, making this right side slightly fatter than the left side and making this region slightly fatter as well, right? But you can see how imprecise I am. Now I'm going to slightly reduce the opacity on that and make a new layer above it. And here's where I'm going to add some of my ornamentation. So what I first like to do is take these kind of straight lines at the top of letters and bring them in like this. And in fact, I think today will even come sort of out like this. We're going to make these sort of funky serifs at the top of each of the stems. So I'm essentially drawing like these little wings coming off of the top to replace the corners. And then, you know, in that bottom sketch layer, you can see that when I erase that region, we're left like with these cute little winged serifs. And I'm going to do the same at the bottom. I often draw myself this dot kind of like in the middle of the stem, and then draw the wings sort of out like that, and then draw them up to connect to the sides. That creates like a relatively even serif, right? And I'll just do a little bit of quick erasing here of my sketch that's underneath. Okay, now I want to find a way to divide the letter roughly in half to create the type of ornamented drop cap that gives the sensation that there's ornamentation top, bottom, and middle. And so one way to do that is to actually divide the stems pretty much in half. I'm going to mirror this sort of winged shape that I created at the top, and I'm going to mirror it right down here. So I'm drawing it again. Okay. And then if I come in and redraw the top of this stem slightly thinner, and then I erase what was there before.
It's like it's wearing a cowboy boot.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. It's a pretty fun and easy way to take any straight stem. You can envision now that you could do this on an E, H, B, D, L, all of these letters that have these straight stems. You can use this concept. Over here on the left, I could do the exact same thing like this, or I could undo. I could just do one big swoosh, and I think that's what I'm going to do on this one. So it's a little bit thinner and more delicate, and I'm going to create one like this over here. Okay, so essentially what we're going to be left with, you'll see, is 3 regions that kind of give the sensation of the bottom of the M, and 3 that kind of give the sensation of the top of the M. So you will see what I mean now. Oops, there we go. All right, so if I zoom out, you can now see that we have sort of this region at the top, or these thinner strokes, and then these thicker, sort of more ornate areas on the bottom and right side. All right, so what we're going to do now is go over this outline using one of my monoline pens to create our first outline of the drawing. And so this is really going to smooth out the strokes and just create a much easier design to work with when we're doing color and texture and ornamentation. I'm going to merge down my sketch because it doesn't matter now if it's all on one layer, and slightly reduce its opacity. On the upper layer, let me now use black for the sake of your contrast. And I think I will select, where am I, monoline? The monoline brush set from the new pack. So I have a few here that you'll be able to choose from, and this is really gonna depend sort of on how much you want to create a very sleek and smooth design, or one that's more organic and hand-drawn looking, or perhaps one that has texture infused right into the drawing. So this first one is your classic. This is what I call Molly's favorite monoline because it's completely smooth and completely pressure insensitive, meaning that no stroke width changes occur based on pressure. You have the second, which is textured, and there's actually randomized texture within the strokes themselves, which can be cool. And then I think what I'm going to actually use today is this rough outliner monoline. And so what this is it's also pressure insensitive, but it creates texture on the edges of the stroke rather than within the stroke color itself. And I just think that's going to make for a kind of cool texture effect on the outline of the M. So we're going to start with that. I'm on this new blank layer to do my outlining. And so now I'm just going to come down with, let's say, a medium-sized monoline brush and go over this pretty loosely. I say loosely because to me, my goal here is not to make some geometrically perfect design. I kind of like the organic look of it. But if geometric perfection is your thing, you could follow these guides a lot more closely and spend a lot more time duplicating the curves so that they're really identical throughout.
But when you see old monoline, often they are, sorry, not monoline, monograms.
Mm-hmm.
They often are a bit imperfect, I've noticed.
That's true. That's true. And especially because we're going to be adding that flourished calligraphy over top of it in a minute, that's going to bring in that whole flowy organic look anyway. So I just tend to feel like this is going to complement it pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
So, oops.
Marie says, I like imperfection.
I do too.
You would love my singing voice then, Marie. Donna says, perfectly imperfect, we'll call it.
Yeah, my singing voice as well. All right, so now I have this my outline done with the rough outliner pen. And I'll turn off my sketch because I'm not going to need it anymore now. I'm going to actually slightly center this more in the page. Doesn't have to be perfectly centered. I just don't want it really off kilter. All right, I can also turn off my guides. What I'm going to do now is change the color of this from black to white because we're going to be coloring in the interior. And I want the outline to be visible without being dominant. So to quickly change this over to white, you could either hit invert if you did it in pure black like I did a moment ago. But if you didn't, one fast way is to tap alpha lock, go over to pure white by double tapping in the pure white region, and it'll snap over to white for you. And then tap your layer again and say fill layer, and that'll fill it with white. Just turn back off alpha lock. Now I'm going to duplicate this because essentially what I'm going to need is to have an outline layer that sits on the top, an outline layer that sits on the bottom, and then we're going to put texture layers in between those two. So you'll see what I mean, but duplicating this layer first is pretty important. And we're going to work now with the lower of the two layers, the bottom layer. So now I'm coming into my palette. I'm going to select this medium orange color here, and I'm just dragging it over, dropping it, and filling in these three areas of the M. Now I will select a slightly lighter color. That's still too dark. I want a bit more contrast. There we go. Yeah. And I'm going to fill these other areas. Okay. So looking in our layers palette here, you can see that we have this blank outline layer still on the top and the filled in layer at the bottom. So next what we're going to do is create a new blank layer in between the two, so above the fill layer. Here I want to add some texture right away because I want to create the illusion that there's dimension within the letter itself. So rather than creating dimension and making the entire letter three-dimensional, like with drop shadow and stuff like that, I want to create the illusion that each of these sections is sitting on top of another section so that they're casting drop shadows onto each other, sort of. So here on my blank layer is where I'm going to add my texture. I'm tapping it once and immediately turning it to multiply so that I can make sure that like the blending of the texture and my background color is going to be really, really nice. Coming over to that darker color I used and selecting something even just a hair darker than that. And now I'm opening my textures set. So this texture set is for a lot of the media that are in the kit, ranging from like ink and watercolor to dry textures as well. And I want a dry texture here for this drop shadow or inner shadow. So I'm going to use this grainy shadow brush, which I created actually when I was making art just like this for the sensation of overlapping strokes. And I just want to show you a sampling of it here. It is very pressure sensitive, so pressing lighter controls the size and density and color, and then pressing harder gets you larger brush strokes and greater density. So what I'm going to do is sort of fill in with just sort of big, completely random splotches, these areas where this overlapping is going to occur. And then I can come over with an eraser brush and I can just quickly erase the areas that are in these darker regions, plus the areas on the side. Now, it is crucial that you have this layer above it, this blank outline layer. And the reason for that, you can see, is that if I turn it off, you're going to see that my texture appears in over the outline. And we don't want that. So this is why this outline layer keeps almost like a mask, keeps those textures like really pure in the center colors. So,
and just to repeat, Molly, which brush was used for that gritty texture? Because it's stunning.
It's my grainy shadow brush.
Grainy shadow brush, everyone. Okay.
Yep, grainy shadow brush. So, oops, I'm erasing the wrong layer. Okay, so I'm just going to continue here real quick. Again, because we have that outline there, this goes really quickly. Just erase all that. Bam, we're done. Now, what you can do is, of course, adjust the opacity now of this layer for the level or depth of texture that you want. If you've ever made it so that you don't feel that it has enough depth, you can always duplicate a multiplied layer and increase your texture. I don't want that for this. I want it to be a little bit more subtle. But yeah, let's put it like something like that. And you'll see that in a moment when we put that flourished calligraphy M over top of it, I do want this M in the background to not be too distracting. That's why I'm keeping it to a relatively limited palette. All right, but let's add a few more fun things here. So let's see, I'm going to go back not to white, but to that very light color that's kind of my background color right now. And I'm coming back into my monoline pens. And I'm going to select this small dot monoline, which is a very simple sort of ornamentation or accent that you can add really to any sort of letter for instant ornamentation. And I just want to point out to you that if you draw with this brush and you let it snap to a shape, like I've snapped it here to a line, you can then condense and expand the number of dots that you had created before the line snapped. And it's a great way to adjust the spacing between those dots, if that makes sense. So let me just do that one more time. Okay. So I'm doing like the most classic and simple sort of inline ornamentation here right now. I'm just drawing some dots down the center. I'll make a new layer just because I like to keep all of the different types of ornamentation separated onto their own layers. And I'll come back to my rough outliner pen. And I think what I'll do is I'll draw some inlines or center lines here. I'll drop this below my texture so that the texture and that shadow still feels like it's being cast over top of my ornamentation. And you can just have a lot of fun with this, feeling like you're sort of making only very simple lines, but at the same time, just adding greater depth and greater ornamentation or decoration, I guess is a better word, to the overall design. Now we can come back and add a lot more to this in a minute when we have time, but I want us to create the draft now of the calligraphy letter on top of it, because that's really what's going to enable us to see which parts need more ornamentation and, which parts already have enough contrast. So let's start by grouping all these parts of the M together so that we can control them as one group. So I'm just tapping one and swiping right on all of them and hitting group. So now all of this is condensed together into one folder, and I can easily turn it on and off at will. So now mentally we're switching over to script calligraphy for a second. So I'm going to come
Amazing.
over.
And just before we switch, can
Yes.
everyone let me know in the live chat? Are you following along? Okay, so far it's very clear from where I'm sitting, but I just want to make sure that everyone's keeping up.
Okay, good.
Do let us know.
And
It looks awesome though, and I love the palette, Molly. Beautiful.
Thank you. Yes, and do of course let me know if there are questions, because I can't be reading the chat while I'm looking down, so you'll let me know.
Cool.
All right.
I think everyone's following along just perfect.
Great. Okay, so now I have a bright contrasting color, which I'm going to use to create a new lettering guide. I like to choose these bright colors like bright pink and bright purple for my guides because I don't usually draw my letters with them. So I always just choose a color that I know I'm probably not going to be using in my design so that it creates contrast. So I have this bright pink, and I'm coming back over to my letter guides, and I can select a couple different options here for calligraphy, but I'm going to just select this calligraphy guide, and I'm going to create a big spot of it over top of my previous M. And now, just like the previous guide, I'll reduce the opacity somewhat. Now a new blank layer, and I'm going to return to my letter sketching pencil brush. And again, remember that, and this is more important with calligraphy even, that when you're sketching lightly versus hard, you can sketch thin versus thick strokes in just the one pencil. So this is helpful for me when I'm doing calligraphy, where the upstrokes and the downstrokes and the differentiation between them is crucial. All right, so let me zoom into this corner and show you. This is roughly the M shape that I'm going to be going for. I have that in my head in advance because it is a little bit confusing sometimes to try to draw a shape over another shape. So just keep the M in the background slightly in your eye, but kind of ignore it at the same time. You'll see what I mean.
Is it like when you're trying to sing the tune to one song, but there's another one playing on the radio and it's impossible?
It's a bit like that. Yeah, it is a bit like that. If we turned this off, we could do that, but I like to keep it on just because you'll see it helps me to visualize where they're going to overlap. So it can take a bit of practice, but don't worry, we're going to adjust it a lot. There's going to be a lot of trial and error on this. So I'm just basically drawing in my M sketch here. Now remember how I was talking about how upstrokes in calligraphy and in a lot of lettering are thin and the downstrokes are the thick strokes. So in an M, the entry stroke or the left side of the M is the thin stroke. Then it moves into a thick downstroke, thin upstroke, thick downstroke. So what does that mean for us here? That means that this is a thick stroke. Let me increase my pencil size even more so I can just like draw really high contrast for you at home. I just want to make really sure that this tracks for you at home. All right, and that this will be a thick stroke as well, a very thick stroke. So essentially we want to make a flourished letter that is as high contrast as possible or as bold as possible so that it really contrasts against the letter that's behind it. So let's start again from the starting point, which is here, and just visualize where those up and down strokes are and make sure that we're getting the thick strokes in the right place. So we're starting here. Oh, we're going down now. So this region is a downstroke. It's going to be thicker. This is a long upstroke. Now we're falling into this big downstroke. Now we're moving into another upstroke. There's a bit of a downstroke region right here. Horizontal stroke, which counts as a downstroke. And then this big long downstroke here, followed by a big curl. Okay, that looks good for now, but I'm going to hit my selection right away. And I'm coming either, depending on how your letter looks, I would select either distort or warp. Because what I want to do, and I'm selecting warp here, I'm going to just tweak this sketch ever so slightly so that the way that it overlaps the M below it is really what I want it to be. You'll be able to visualize this in a moment, I suppose, when you see how I go about making them look overlapping. But basically, I want a lot of the calligraphed M to show and have some really nice regions like, let's say, look over here on the far left, the very beginning of the cursive M. It was previously like this, exactly covering that one ornament on the M below it. I'm not really a fan of that, so I'm kind of pulling it out, pushing and pulling with my warp tool. Yeah, to make that ornament show a little bit better. Hopefully that makes sense, but if it didn't, don't worry, because you're going to see in the next step exactly how I go about inking that. All right. Reducing the opacity dramatically now on that letter, and I'll even turn off that guide because I don't think it's that necessary. Maybe even you at home will like to see how this looks just without the distraction of the other letter for a second. Okay, so now I'm going to come over to my pointed pen set, and all of these are new pointed pens. Just for the record, I've taught many sessions on here with my other pointed pen kit. And I just want to make sure that you're aware that these are all brand new additional ones that also emulate the metal pointed pen calligraphy pens. So I'm going to select here this Super Flex pointed pen, which if you do ink on paper calligraphy is very much akin to like a Browser nib that has like really, really fine hairline points, but is super flexible metal. So it makes very bold strokes when you press down. I'm also going to select a very high contrast color like this dark blue. And now, in fact, what I usually do before I even draw is I test out the size of the pen just to make sure I'm going to get the right thin strokes and thick strokes that I want. And indeed I am. I like this stroke contrast. So I'm coming in and nope, you know what? I want it to be thicker. I want even more drama. Yeah, I like that. Good. And so I'm coming in here. And sometimes, you know, you'll get it right the first time, or especially if you're flourishing and you're flourishing so large, I'm gonna zoom out. So when I'm doing this on my own, I actually zoom out quite a lot. And the reason for that is because it's a shorter distance for my hand to travel. So for the sake of a video, probably it makes more sense if it's really, really close, but I'll bring it close again in a second. All right. Yeah, much less distance for the hand to travel. All right, cool. And now I just quickly come back here and I turn back on this M because it's important, again, for me to see how the two overlay. So zooming back in again here for you. I like the way these overlay. When I turn off the sketch, I can be sure of that. I'm going to change this calligraphed M now to a different blending mode, such as linear burn, because now I can see the drop cap M below it or through it, and I'm able to really evaluate where the overlaps happen and where the editing of my flourished M needs to take place. So our goal now is to make it look like this flourished calligraphy M is sort of wrapping itself around the drop cap, not like it's just sitting on top, but that the two are sort of intertwined. So we're going to do that quite simply by erasing parts of the M. But rather than erase, I really want to mask it out so that I don't actually lose the calligraphy M itself. So I'm going to tap it once and hit mask. If you're not super familiar with these masks, just know that all that happened here is that I created a mask connected to this layer only. And on that, I can write with white, black, or shades of gray in between. And white reveals and black hides, okay? So you'll see that as soon as you move into a layer mask, the color in your color palette changes immediately to either white or black. So I want to hide parts of this M, so I want to draw with black on my mask. To get pure black, double tap roughly in the bottom of that region of your color wheel in the black area, and it will snap to pure black. So now I'm making sure I'm on that mask, and I'm going to come in here and find certain areas to paint out. So let me just quickly show you how this looks. Don't follow along with what I'm doing. This is a demo. So you see how I'm drawing on this with black, and it looks like I'm erasing it. If I open my layers palette, you see here that you see drawing on my layer mask. And if I turn off the visibility of this mask, my calligraphy appears again. So this is just to demonstrate to you that I didn't erase anything. I just hid it. I covered it up with black. So just to be clear here, I'm going to clear it now so that I can start over. Let's see. Let me do one more thing too. I'm going to copy the group of my drop cap below. I'm going to just duplicate it, and I'm going to flatten it. And the reason for that is that I've essentially now made myself a template from which I can easily mask out the flourished M. Here's what I mean by that. If I tap it once and hit select, my selection, I hope you can see that, those sort of the lines of the selection. The selection is selecting only what's in that drop cap area. And that's going to make it really easy for me on my layer mask to paint out just the region that overlaps the drop cap letter below it. So here's another example. Let's see. Do I want, this is a bit of trial and error. You can decide, for example, do I want that region to look like it's behind the drop cap? Maybe not. Would I prefer if this region looked like it was behind it? Yeah, I think that's kind of cuter. Maybe I want this one to be behind it. Generally, when I'm doing this on my own, I play with this quite a bit. Yep, I like that. So let me just do it a bit more precisely.
This is looking really cool, Molly.
Thanks. Thank you. Do people have questions about what I've done so far, or like the nibs that I've used or whatever? Because I'm not sure if I went too quickly with my brush names.
I think everyone is good. I'm seeing a lot of very kind words about what a great teacher you are. There's a few questions, but happy to cover those at the end in Q&A if that suits, Molly. Of
course, of course. Alrighty, so I'm liking how this looks. You can see, let me just grab some pink here. I want to be able to, this is like the equivalent of my teacher's laser pointer here. So you see, oops, not pink at all. Wait. Okay, you can see that right here, I masked out the M. Also right here, and right there. So in these four areas, I masked out the M. And that had the effect of making those fine flourished strokes of the M appear to be behind the drop cap, whereas the rest, or the majority of the flourished M, is above the drop cap. So it can really make it feel like it's wound around. Now, I hope it's clear that this technique doesn't just work for the letter M, and there are just so many infinite possibilities of L and O, C. It doesn't matter if it's curved or straight lines or angled lines. You can apply this technique of overlapping, flourishing, and heavy, bold drop caps. So I've turned off my selection. It was previously selected, and I just hit this selection tool up here to deselect. So now I'm deselected. And now when I draw in this layer mask, I'm going to just do some very quick refining here, because I see that my slightly shaky on-screen over-caffeinated hand made some strokes that I consider imperfect. And I'm just going to quickly perfect them here. There you go. All right. So now the fun comes in terms of decorating some more. We're going to decorate the flourished M now. So you remember how we made these inlines in the drop cap M by creating lines with the monoline pen that mirrored the outline? Now we're going to use another pointed pen to create pointed pen in lines in the flourished M. So on a new blank layer, I'm coming over to not pure white. We're going to go back to that same background color, keep things kind of complementing each other. And I'm not going to stay on my super flex pointed pen. That's going to be a bit too heavy for inlines. I'm going to come, I think, to my stiff pointed pen, which for you calligraphers out there is a lot more like a Nico G or something like that. Okay, so I'm going to create strokes that kind of pass over the thick downstrokes of the M and have a calligraphic weight to them, meaning starting out with low pressure, increasing pressure to be thicker, and decreasing pressure at the end to finish off thin. So increased pressure and decreased. And I'll even experiment with how it looks in some of these slightly less thick regions. Not a fan right there. Let's see if I like it here. Nope, not a fan of that either. So then we can add, so I would call those inlines, and then we can add highlight lines as well on any flourished calligraphy. So that's going to be its own new layer. And we'll select that same dark color that I used for the bottom half of the M. And again, making sure we're on a new layer. I'm going to draw similar types of strokes within or around some of these curves. Some of them on the inside, some of them on the outside. It doesn't really matter. There we go. I kind of zoom around, in and out, in and out. I have to be honest that when I do recordings, like for classes and for YouTubes, I think I make people like quite car sick, and I have to really tell myself, stop zooming in and out and in and out. So I apologize if I'm just going crazy here with the zooming and moving. All right, I like that. I'm gonna add a couple more. I like that overall, yes. Okay, so just to review slightly, we created our M with the flex pointed pen nib, and then we created highlights and inlines with a stiffer nib, the stiff pointed pen nib. And we masked out the regions after setting it to linear burn so that it looks like it's wound around that lowercase, or I'm sorry, that drop case M that's behind it. Now, let's see. I'm going to create a new blank layer at the top. And I want to add some texture overall, because now we have this, at least some texture already added to our drop cap, but overall the design to my eye looks quite crisp and clean, and I want to dirty it up a little bit, to be honest. So on a new blank layer above everything, I'm coming over to a light color. Let's see, actually lighter than the background. Let's just do white first. And come back to my texture set. Now this is where we had found the grainy shadow brush before to create that fun texture inside the M, but that's too precise, too much of a detail brush for what I want to do now. So I'm going to come over, I think, to my Grunge overlay brush, which is actually a really subtle texture. And I'm going to just paint it over my whole canvas first. You can see it almost looks like snow over top of everything first. And then I'll reduce the opacity quite dramatically. This is almost like a step one to add texture. I like to layer a bunch of textures so that it really looks as organic as possible. You can even set this to soft light. And if you have much darker colors in your canvas, setting it to soft light is going to have even more of a dramatic effect than what you just saw here. Oops, there we go. Now on a new blank layer, I'm going to create vignetting texture. So going over to a dark color and selecting, let's do the noise overlay brush. I'm going to zoom out and set my brush to be pretty large. And then I'm going, oh, that's too large. And then I'm going to draw sort of almost like just a circle around my canvas. And I'm going to go over it a couple times to build up the texture, because with this brush, the more you draw, the more texturized it gets. Now, I don't like how the texture overlaps and doesn't blend at all with the artwork below it. So all I'm going to do is change its blending mode from normal to multiply. And now it really darkens when it's over top of the darker color. I'm also going to reduce the overall opacity because I consider this way too dramatic a vignette. Something like that, I think. Hopefully that's visible to you. Yep. There we go. And let's see. I don't know how much more time we have, but normally I would come back in here more. And given that we now have the overlay of the two letters, I'd come into this drop cap and add some even more ornamentation, like perhaps
it's totally your call, Molly. I think we're okay on time.
Okay, amazing, amazing. I lose track. I just kind of keep babbling. All right, so I'm going to come back down here. I'm going to turn off. Remember how I created that flattened layer to use only as a selection? I'm turning it off because I prefer to work with my layered file. So I'm going to come over here to this region, remember, that's in between the top outline and the bottom filled in. And I'm going to create a new layer in that gap, in that space, because I'm going to add even more texture. So I'm here with this slightly darker orange brush, and I'm immediately setting this layer to multiply because I really know already that I want it to be darker and perfectly blended with the color that I'm going to draw on top of. Now in my texture brushes, I'm going to use a different one. I'm going to use, actually, maybe I'll use this really fun one, the Spotty texture brush, because here in this area, I have already added these dots. So maybe adding spots is going to complement it quite well. So you can see that this brush, I'm being relatively imprecise, but I can just erase the edges. So you see how this brush just creates these like tiny little polka dots, and we can reduce the opacity slightly so that it almost looks textured. At least on my screen, this actually is quite reminiscent of terracotta, how tiles can have sort of textured, semi-random, but also not texture to them. That's how it's looking to me, at least on my screen. And this does correlate with brush size. So I have like a relatively large version of it now, but you can definitely make much smaller spots. Yep, and let's just fill this in over here. So this is texture, of course, but I do consider it just as much pattern. You can use this brush as an overlay brush too, almost like a funkier version of a halftone. It's not exactly a halftone pattern, but something similar. And yeah, that just adds a lot of visual interest and depth. And you can even make a new layer and do the same for the top. Let's do that with a light layer as well. Ooh, that's too light of a color that I picked. Yeah, I think that that could actually look really fun. It's the type of thing that from a distance, you're not necessarily going to see all of the spots, but you're going to see that it's not a flat color at all, that it kind of adds like just this really nice texture. I'm going to put, let's see, I'm going to put these inlines up above it so that they pop out even a little bit more. And then I'm going to reduce those spots slightly and set them to multiply. All right, let's just take a little tour, shall we? We'll zoom in a little bit here. Just so that you can see kind of the way that I've approached all of these textures. So I have the texture vignette on the edge, on the border. Let me get my laser pointer here again. Okay, I have the vignette texture on the edge. I have the grunge texture over the whole canvas. I have the spotty texture in the background of this color and in the background of the areas of this color. I have the dotted monoline accents in these three shapes. And I just have simple monoline inline accents on all of the rest. And then for the flourished calligraphy, I stuck with just two pens, just the flex pointed pen and the stiff pointed pen. And I didn't add texture to that except for the texture that went over the entire canvas, because I really personally like that contrast a lot. One last thing, I know that I'm now at this point babbling, but
Far from it, Molly.
I like this contrast a lot of like the super bright blue against the muted muted oranges. But if you wanted overall a much more delicate look, you could change this M to something that was more reminiscent of the background. So the way to do that without making it a permanent change is to create a new blank layer over top of the M, tap it once and hit clipping mask. And now when we fill this layer with a color, it will apply to the M without permanently changing the M. Okay, so let's do that. Let's choose one of these oranges. Let's take a poll of who prefers bright color contrast versus contrast kind of like this. So we have like...
It's really tough because I love this, and then you just changed it. I was like, ooh, that's super nice as well. So what should we say? What do you prefer?
Orange or blue?
Blue or orange?
This is hard. This is
okay. If you click on polls below this live stream, everyone cast your vote. I'm really intrigued. Blue or orange? What's it going to be?
Yeah, I can think, like, I'll say that if you were using this to have to sort of be in a background, right? Like if there was going to be text overlaid, or if the whole thing was going to have a reduced opacity somehow, definitely keeping it this limited color palette would be great. But if the point of it is to like pop out,
it's super close. I can see a bunch of people still haven't voted. So click on polls. Molly, if you click on polls, you can actually watch it.
I can
it's
see
like
it.
It's like a horse race.
Oh, I see people.
And we got blue about to win by a nose, but orange is trailing, not far behind.
Love it. No, it's interesting. I mean, color, of course, color makes the design in so many cases, but changes completely the look instantly. I'm going to put it back to blue because that's what you guys prefer and what I prefer.
That's what won.
Yeah, there we go. Alrighty. Oh, it's already 6:20. So tell me, what questions do you have and what else can I show you? Or can I review something that I just did or answer questions about the pack?
First of all, amazing. As ever, Molly. I love it. I always feel so inspired. And I'm sure I say this every time, but I literally, sorry, design cutters, I feel like I want to quit my job as Design Cuts founder and go pick up an iPad and just do beautiful letters because it looks so much fun. Like you inspire me every single time. So everyone, this is Molly's brand new pack. This is an exclusive with Design Cuts.
Yes.
And it is, all I'm going to say is it is incredible, but I'll let Molly talk you through it properly.
Yeah, so thank you. This pack has 150 different brand new brushes, which are all optimized for hand lettering in all different media. So today you saw calligraphy and monoline and textures, but there are also, actually here's the list. There are also pens for watercolor and chalk, for flat tip calligraphy styles, for really funky gestural writing, like with markers and ink brushes. Let's go down to some of these previews. So here are, for example, the 12 different pointed pens, which are all new brushes, and each of them have their own stroke characteristics, pressure sensitivity, and sort of feel very much like different metal nibs. And you can see also there are 2 ombre brushes there because I really love my ombre. Coming back down here. Oh, this is, I have to pause on this, by the way. This is an amazing piece that my peer friend Sarah Richardson made with the classic calligraphy pen in the pack, and I just was blown away when she sent me this. I'm always, nervous when you make you make a product and you put it out there in the world, or you share it with someone, and you hope that they like it and use it the way that you do. And I was just blown away. It looked exactly like her real copperplate writing. All right, so I showed you a lot of the mono lines, but you can see even more examples there. And just want to reiterate that I love using mono lines for letters themselves, but also a lot for outlines. And they're really, really good for creating outlines of letters that you're going to vectorize later or turn into products or have in any way to create a really crisp edge. So I use my mono lines a lot for things like that. There are also practice sheets that come in the pack. There's these monoline practice sheets, and I think I skipped right by it before, but there are calligraphy practice sheets too. Watercolor pens, all new pens that I have just absolutely loved programming. This is definitely one of the most fun but challenging pen sets in the pack. I made sure that they were like really layerable, like real brush pens, and had different like watery and paper textures. And also have a lot of ink washes and watercolor washes in here that you can create, what's the word, negative space calligraphy in, if that's your thing. We didn't even get into marker brushes today, but maybe in my next session, because I'm really loving brush marker lettering these days. But there are 12 different marker pens that are each, they each equate to a real analog tool. So like this first one, the washable felt tip, it's like Crayola kids markers, which I don't know if you're like me, tell me in the comments. I love Crayola kids markers to this day. As an adult, is one of my favorite markers to use, and I just relax and color with them. So I thought I have to make the equivalent of that for Procreate. So here's a piece made by a friend of mine using various marker brushes. And again, I was just blown away because it's cool to see what people make with your tools that you wouldn't even have thought of. So more practice sheets. Chalk lettering writers, lots of them. A lot of my focus was on making sure that the resolution of these textures is so high quality that even on really big canvases, really high resolution canvases and products for print, that they really translate. Letter inkers, this is one of my favorite sets. This is for really gestural calligraphy. And let me just say that if you're a lettering artist who actually feels like you adhere a lot to grids and guides and you really stress uniformity in your letters, but you just kind of want to relax sometimes, I actually think that this is for you. That's what I made it for me, because I'm often such a perfectionist, and I made this set that is actually all about imperfection, not using a guide, being really organic, creating ink splotches, uneven strokes, uneven slants. It's a whole lot of fun. And then there's some new guide brushes in here. And of course, you saw me already combine my pencil brushes and my guide brushes. But you can really create, again, as you saw in today's session, a lot of high contrast styles between textured drop caps and flourished calligraphy. We have some flat tip pens like these sign painting brushes, and then parallel pens for styles like this, like black letter and other broad tip traditional Gothic styles and stuff like that. Some fun ribbon pens, 3D pens, which actually write with dimension automatically. You don't need to layer them at all. Just a single stroke of the pen actually will create dimension either off to the left or off to the right, and they come in both monoline and pointed pen stroke styles. So those are actually a whole lot of fun. And then there's this grab bag.
I love this.
Okay, this is literally, I made a bunch of these brushes and I thought, I almost didn't put them in the pack because I thought to myself, okay, what do I call them? Like there's nothing cohesive. And then I just decided what actually makes them cohesive is that they're all just fun. So that's what this is, the fun brush set. I have like a neon tube. I have this like balloon brush. And then this is my favorite, this twisted ribbon brush. It truly writes like you're making a twisted ribbon. You genuinely don't have to do anything except draw, and it draws like this. I just literally wrote out those numbers without doing anything else. And then the texture brushes, which you've already seen. This is one of the techniques we talked about today, combining all of these kinds of textures. And background brushes, lots of them, which are translucent and change color based on your palette. And last but not least, you will get a bonus in this pack with 44 shape stamps, which you can not only use to actually create frames for your artwork, but you can definitely combine them with the letter guide stamps so that you can create layout designs that aren't just linear or geometric, but that actually have these kinds of fun shapes incorporated into them as well. So
wow, that is ridiculous.
Yes.
I think Bill just said it best. He said these DC exclusives really provide extra value, and he kept saying the page never ends.
Yeah.
Molly, credit to you. This is just, I think, the most comprehensive lettering pack I've ever seen. it really has everything, and the quality I know firsthand is incredible. But if you've seen Molly work, and obviously today's demo demonstrates that, you're so meticulous, you're so thorough with your lettering, and you're such a consummate professional. I feel like you've just poured all of that into this pack, so it is mind-blowingly good. Molly, thank you again. Amazing session. I'm always so inspired. I said that at the start, but I loved every single minute of that. I could tell the community absolutely loved it as well and learned a ton. So everyone, let's please give it up for Molly and the team. If everyone can please go follow and support Molly. She's incredible, such a generous teacher in this community. But Molly, thank you. So good.
Thank you, all of you.